Hello, thank you for being here today. I'm Felicity Ezewike. Our new report about international idea, the Global State of Democracy Report 2025, delivers a sobering verdict. Worldwide, democracy is weakening and press freedom has plummeted to its lowest point in 50 years, and more than half of the countries reviewed are experiencing some form of democratic backsliding, whether it's shrinking civic space, weakened rule of law, or executive overreach. In Africa, 15 countries were flagged for significant decline in press freedom alone. In many countries, journalists are being silenced, civic voices are being pushed out, and democratic checks and balances are being eroded, sometimes quietly, other times violently. From rigged elections to jailed reporters and blocked social media, we're seeing worrying trends that affect not just governments, but everyday people, how they live, how they work, how they protest, or even how they post online. The findings of the report raises critical questions about the health of our democracies, the role of the media, and the future of civic participation in Africa. To help us unpack what seems like Africa's challenges as much as it is that of the rest of the world, we're joined by someone at the heart of this global analysis, the head of program for democracy assessment at International IDEA, Seema Shah. Thank you very much for being here.
Pleasure.
All right, let's start with your overview of the key findings from the 2025 report, particularly as it concerns Africa.
So the key findings are indeed sobering. Around the world, we see drops in things like credible elections, civil liberties, especially freedom of the press, judicial independence, personal integrity, and security, which means people's everyday safety. In Africa, those trends are mirrored. What we saw is that freedom of the press is also one of the most declining factors in the African context, as is credible elections. Still, though, there is a bright side. African countries continue to do well in factors of participation. In fact, when we look at civic engagement, 6 of the top 20 countries in the world are African countries.
The report mentions a 50-year low in press freedom globally. What factors, in your view, contributed to this decline, especially in African countries?
So there's a range of things that contribute to press decline, including things like increased concentration of media ownership, attacks against journalists and media outlets, including physical attacks, but it can also be digital harassment of journalists. We've seen that around the world, especially female journalists. We've also seen targeted defamation cases against journalists initiated by the government in some cases. In Africa, we've seen all of those examples. We've seen, for example, state censorship in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. We've seen regulatory crackdowns on the media in places like Senegal. We've seen suspension of media outlets in Togo, concentration of media ownership across the continent.
Which African nations have seen the most significant drops in press freedom, and what are the underlying causes that was found?
Really it spans the sort of spectrum of reasons why press freedom would decline, including legislation that restricts the space for media to operate freely. That's been the case in Zambia. And like I said, state censorship in places like DRC, and the suspension of media outlets outright in places like Togo. In our regional definitions, we have Africa and West Asia as one region, and one of the countries that stands out in that data set is Palestine, for the incredible state of media restrictions there and attacks against journalists. I don't know off the top of my head which country has declined the most, but Palestine stands out to me in the broader region as one of the steepest declines in the past year.
Okay, let's stick with the global report for a bit. How does the decline in press freedom correlate with other democratic indicators such as electoral integrity and civil liberties? We'll look at that globally, and then perhaps you can narrow it down to how it impacts Africa.
Sure. So what we see around the world actually is that press freedom tends to decline, especially around elections. What we see is that journalists are increasingly targeted around the election period, during the campaign period, especially in the lead up to elections. And then if there are alleged irregularities or problems with the way an election is implemented, then we see journalists targeted in the aftermath as they try and report on those issues as well. So there's a very high correlation between election time and attacks on the press. And we see that in African countries as well. But it's not just elections. It's even, in the past few years, we've seen a rise in protests around the world, including in Africa. And we have seen press targeted for covering those protests and in some cases, being falsely accused of things like aiding protesters, etc.
Are there any African countries that the report showed has some resilience or improvement in democratic practices despite this global trend where we see a decline?
Yes, we called out South Africa and Botswana for party turnover, milestone party turnover in elections. And the reason that is important is because it shows that elections still act as levers of public power, symbolically and practically. And that mirrors other milestone elections we've seen in the past couple of years. For example, we talk about how there have been important new pro-democratic reforms put in place after electoral victories in Poland and Brazil. And so now we are watching African spaces, African contexts for that same kind of new energy when a new government comes into power. And both of those elections in Botswana and South Africa stood out for their credibility and sort of broad legitimacy in terms of public approval.
Yeah, you said South Africa and Botswana had a massive turnout in elections, and these are indicators that democracy is working there. Are there aspects to their practice that the international idea might have picked out that perhaps other African countries can key into in the efforts to improve the practice of democracy?
So there are a few things that we talk about. When we measure what we call credible elections, we're looking at things like the independence of the election body, the election management body, so the election commission that's responsible for administering an election. We look at how political parties are treated, and if there's freedom for them to operate and campaign safely, if there's equality under the rule of law for all parties. We also look at things like irregularities at the polling station and how those are handled. In previous reports, we have called out the importance of communication with the public so that election commissions, keep their public informed about what is going on as the process proceeds, so that people understand, okay, there might be a problem, but this is how we're handling it. We are on top of things. We've actually called out the Nigerian Election Commission for handling that communication process well in the past by providing daily updates and allowing Q&As with the public, et cetera. That's really important and is a model.
Okay, let's look at the average. It's not even an average. You mentioned just two countries in the whole of Africa whose practice seem to be, working and supporting the process of election and democracy generally, and the people are showing real interest in participating in the process. Isn't that a terrible testament or analogy of the reality in Africa? We have over 50 countries, and we're talking about two. How worried is the initiative, like the international idea, about this particular correlation?
I just want to make it clear that just because we called out to African countries for party turnover does not mean that there are only 2 countries doing well in Africa. That is definitely not the case. There are lots of reasons to be hopeful about countries all over the world, but including in Africa. And
not to interrupt you, but they did get special mention because there were specific things that they were doing right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so the fact that they are doing that right, it's not a good picture for Africa that it is only 2 countries that are just a little above average in how people participate in the election process and how they are pushing their democracy. So I'm sitting on that because it is important if we're going to try and really have a conversation as to how we are going to improve the process, don't you think?
Yeah, for sure. But again, those elections were recent and the report is published annually. That's why we called them out. But I can tell you, for example, that in the past, we've also talked about, how Senegal's election last year and the process that led up to it was a story of resilience. And again, in that context, stood out for democratic resilience because of how they handled what could have been a very bad outcome. And so in Botswana and South Africa, the reason we paid attention was because, like I said, there was important party turnover, elections were credible, results were broadly accepted, but that doesn't mean that those are the only cases in the entire continent. That said, it's important to think about the other measures of elections, right? So across the continent, unfortunately, we've also recently seen a trend of suppression of political parties and opposition candidates, especially as an election approaches. But that trend we've also seen in other regions of the world. And so, there is very much a drive for incumbents to do what they can to stay in power, sometimes unconstitutionally.
Yeah, I think I want us to stay a bit on the independence of the electoral bodies, because that's one concern that a lot of persons, even you don't have to carry out the reports to know how concerned people are about, the sometimes lack of impartiality, I beg your pardon, of these bodies. So what did that report find out as to some of the reasons why these bodies stay tattered to the government in power?
There could be lots of reasons. One is financing. If the election management body relies on parliamentary financing for functioning, then that creates pressure. There's also how those commissioners or the members of the election management body are appointed. And if that appointment is skewed in one direction or the other, that can create a perception of bias. There's also sometimes a lack of legal clarity around what the line is between the election management body and other government institutions, and what is considered permitted or what the norms even are in terms of communication between those bodies. And so one of the things that we have recommended is that agencies like the Electoral Commission, but also anti-corruption commissions, ombuds offices, the independence of those agencies need to be protected in the law and in practice. Sometimes we have really strong laws, but there is a lack of political will to actually enforce the law. And so you need both. You can't just have a strong law. You need the political will to stick to that, abide by the law.
Yeah, well, protecting their independence also has to do with the financing aspect of it. Is there a suggestion as to how these bodies can be independently funded away from the government in power? We have the civil service, you move from grade level 1 to grade level 2. Is there a suggestion that would work and take away the financing from the government in power? In every country in Africa, really?
It really depends on the context, what the financing model should be. But there could be, even if the EMB is financed by the government, there could be parliamentary oversight, over how those decisions are made, and more transparency in the way the funds are allocated, as well as safeguards put in place so that financing does not depend on the whims of who happens to be in power or personal relationships.
You said something about clarity, legal clarity as to their powers, but you also rightly pointed that it is obtained in most of the laws. It is the political will that stands in the way. How have government policies and actions further contributed to the erosion of the democratic space, really, and that of the media independence on the continent?
I'm not sure I understand your question. How have government policies impacted press freedom? Is that what you're asking?
Yes, yes. Democracy generally, are there laws in that review, that report, that found maybe some actions or policies of government that contributed not just to the erosion of media independence, but of democracy on the continent and globally?
So one of the things we've seen in actually other parts of the world is the institution of what are called hotlines or SOS hotlines for people like human rights defenders and journalists. And so this is a protection measure that are put in place in the law so that there's a independent government-sanctioned legal body that's responsible for responding in the moment to situations where journalists might be under attack or feeling threatened or unsafe. And when they have those kinds of mechanisms in place, not only does it provide comfort and I guess respite for journalists and human rights defenders, but the existence of that body lets everybody else know that there is something in place, that we prioritize protection of journalists, and this is something that is so important that it has its own body and mandate. And so it puts everybody sort of on alert because that institution exists. So we recommend that, and we provide some examples in the report of where those bodies exist.
Okay, let's go back, before we come back more to press freedom, let's go back to the freedom of political parties to really participate in the democratic process. What was the findings on that you can share with us that impacts Africa in one way or the other?
So there seems to be an emerging trend if we look at the first half of the year and even some events last year, of incumbent governments, either through laws or through extra-legal measures targeting opposition politicians or parties to restrict the space they have to compete fairly and safely with incumbents. And these kinds of moves are not new, but they're increasingly being done actually through the law. So they're using existing laws to limit the civic space for parties, and also not just for parties, but also for civil society organizations who act as watchdogs and who would call that kind of behavior out. And that seems to be little more than a ploy, to hang on to power.
Information dissemination. I want you to look at that generally and not just as it affects elections. I want you to talk to us about the findings of the report on the role of misinformation and disinformation in undermining democratic processes in Africa, because we're trying to focus on the African continent. I know this is a global report, but we need to cut it down in bits so we can, begin to work on it.
So our report is based on our own data sets, and we do not have indicators that allow us to comprehensively measure misinformation or disinformation. So I cannot tell you definitively what the data say on those issues. What we do know, though, is that this is an issue around the world where misinformation and disinformation is influencing not just political campaigns, but perceptions of what is happening in one's country by the public. That said, it's important to also remember that misinformation and disinformation have always existed, even before we had digital media. It was still, it has always been there. The issue now is that it's able to be spread so quickly and so widely. that's what we need to pay attention to. And so that's kind of the state of things. And when we measure media freedom, it's sometimes very difficult. And countries are having a lot of difficulty balancing respect for media freedom and freedom of expression generally with information integrity.
Okay. Beyond press freedom, what other democratic indicators have deteriorated in Africa, according to the report?
Credible elections is one of the most widely declining, including in Africa. Judicial independence, also in Africa. Personal integrity and security, also in Africa. Those are some of the most common ones.
Okay. What impact does the weakening of democracy and democratic institutions have on economic development and the social aspect, social cohesion in Africa?
So there's social cohesion, the way we measure it, is a factor. So we call it social group equality, is a factor of democracy. So we measure that as part of what we call political equality. So when you have factionalization in society, or when you have different groups of people being treated differently under the law, or being discriminated against, or having less or varied access to institutions and power, then it disrupts unity and creates, it makes it so that democracy delivers differently for different groups of people, which undermines the very principle of equality that democracy is supposed to be all about. And so that's a problem. In terms of economic equality, that's also globally one of the factors that's declining the most broadly in our data set. And so what we see is that there's a growing gap between extremely disadvantaged parts of the population and extremely wealthy segments of the population. And when you have that kind of inequality, it creates a sense of injustice. People feel that the levers of political power are controlled by people with wealth alone, and that everybody else doesn't have a fair and equal voice. Their voices are not heard in the same way. And so then what you end up having is a situation in which, even when you have a democracy in place, the shape of it and the direction of it is influenced by a very small portion of society.
All right, Seema, what are your thoughts, or what does the report say about how regional bodies, perhaps like the African Union, can respond to and help mitigate some of this democratic backsliding among member states?
One of the things that we recommend, especially in the African context, is that regional bodies come together to show unity around illegal or undemocratic transfers of power, especially, or when incumbents seek to either unconstitutionally or undemocratically extend their terms of power, that regional bodies say something or impose sanctions or hold such leaders or parties accountable for violating the terms of democratic constitutions. So just sort of showing the public that they're serious about demanding accountability for that is in itself a testament to a commitment to democratic norms. So that would be one place to start.
What is the relevance of these reports really? How does it help to change behaviors and governments' attitude and policies towards improving the democratic trends?
Well, what we hope is that policymakers with the power to create interventions and allocate money and make decisions related to democracy read the report and the recommendations and take actions that support democracy in their countries. And we also hope that members of the public read the report so that they're aware of what is happening on the ground in their countries and also in other countries around the world, so that they know what they should be demanding from their government and what recommendations they should be pushing for, or going to civil society with, and working with them to, contribute to advocacy campaigns or efforts for reform. So on both sides, we really hope that the reports like this are a tool for people who want to see democratic change.
How important is civic education in promoting these democratic values and citizen engagement?
I would say it's fundamental, it's foundational to democracy, civic education, not just teaching people what democracy means, but giving them a chance to define it in their own contexts. One of the things we say at International IDEA is that we define democracy extremely broadly: public control over decision makers and equality in the exercise of that control. So you can take those principles and operationalize them in the way that makes sense based on your own country's history, priorities, the trajectory that you want to take. And that's really important to think about from a young age, so that as you grow and you have a chance to influence change, you know what it is you want. But also, in addition to that sort of theory, it's important for students to understand from a young age what it means. What does it mean to have an independent court? Why does it matter if we have an anti-corruption agency? What does voting give me? Why should I vote? How do I hold my leaders accountable? All those things are important, so that by the time you become old enough to participate in a meaningful way, you know what it is that you want, you know what to advocate for, and you know why the values that underpin democracy are important for your daily life, how it impacts you. I think that's one of the things that tends to be missing, is that oftentimes people don't understand that what seems like an abstract term has a very real impact on their daily life.
How would you say Africa is doing with civic education generally, and what would be some areas that some mechanism or strategies that we can employ? We now know the importance of civic education and civic engagement, but are we doing it enough?
So civic education is not really within the scope of our data, but what I can say is that we do measure civic engagement, which deals with how people join associations, either political or non-political associations in their countries, which is a measure of how engaged they are with politics at a general level. And like I said before, African countries tend to do quite well in this measure, which shows that people are interested. Now, it's, I would think, much easier to have civic education programs work when people are interested. They want to know, they're joining associations, they want to be engaged. So I wouldn't pretend to be an expert on civic engagement. I don't really feel comfortable.
Fair enough. How does International IDEA, beyond this report, propose to support not just African countries, but global democracy, really?
So we have three main functions. One is we produce a lot of research and analysis that we hope helps policymakers understand the best interventions that can be formulated to strengthen democracy around the world. We also have teams based in more than 20 countries around the world that offer assistance on the ground. So, you know, if you want help with your voters register, we have teams that help with elections. We have teams that help with constitutional drafting or amendment. We have teams that help with empowerment of different marginalized groups. And then we have work that we call convenings, where we are able to bring together people, whether it's policymakers themselves or civil society organizations, to talk about the issues that are top of mind for them and help them strategize and make action plans based on their own priorities. So research, convenings, and on-the-ground assistance is how IDEA helps around the world.
And we thank you for the important work that you do. Seema, thank you for being here as well.
Thank you very much.